Welcome back to the deep dive. You just lived through the tragic but maybe glorious story of the Alamo. But today, we follow another thread of the Texas Revolution, one that's far darker. It's a story of military blunder ending not just in defeat, but in a truly horrific betrayal. We're jumping right into the smoke and, honestly, the terror that swept Texas in March 1836.
That's right. If the Alamo earned remembrance for a heroic, though obviously fatal, stand, the story we're unpacking today, it's pretty much solely remembered for its profound tragedy and systematic cruelty. This is the disastrous Goliad campaign. Our sources confirm it was a march toward an even more, well, the phrase used is horrific fate than what happened at the Alamo.
Okay, let's really unpack this. We have to start right in the immediate aftermath of San Antonio, don't we? News of the Alamo's fall on March 6th. It wasn't just a military setback, was it? It sounds like it was a moment of just profound terror.
Oh, absolutely. A shockwave just ripped through the settlements. You have to imagine the fear.
So what was General Sam Houston's immediate critical response?
Yeah.
I mean, he couldn't afford a moment of hesitation, sure.
No, he couldn't. Houston understood that the greatest danger now was having his remaining forces picked off one by one. Piecemeal destruction. Santa Anna had just proved very bloodily that he was willing to sacrifice thousands of his own men to crush the rebellion in detail. So Houston's focus immediately shifted to concentration. He had to gather every remaining Texian fighter before the Centralist armies, which were already marching east, could just sweep the territory uncontested.
Right. Concentration makes sense.
Yeah, and our analysis of his communications, it shows the direct, crucial orders he immediately issued to commanders like Colonel James Fannin.
Okay, Fannin. He was the commander holding the Presidio of Bahia Goliad, as we call it. What were those orders, specifically for him?
The command was explicit, immediate, and tactically necessary. Houston ordered Fannin to fall back on Victoria after blowing up La Bahia. The goal was concentration, like we said. Victoria was seen as a defensible position, closer to the centers of Texian population, and, crucially, supply lines. Fannin was supposed to join the main army, which was still forming under Houston. Sacrifice the fort to save the men. That was the idea.
That sounds like sound military doctrine, right? Retreat, regroup, survive to fight another day. Basic stuff, almost.
Right.
But we know Fannin didn't follow this immediately. And you mentioned the grim nature of Goliad stems not just from Fannin's failure, but also from Santa Anna's political doctrine.
Precisely. The tragedy was compounded by the escalating cruelty of the centralist regime. Santa Anna had determined that this rebellion must be utterly extinguished, no compromise. He was strictly enforcing a policy of no quarter. That meant refusing to treat captured Texian combatants as protected prisoners of war.
No quarter. So what did that mean in practice?
It meant, for Santa Anna, these men weren't soldiers fighting a legitimate war. They were armed insurgents, he used terms like pirates, and therefore they were subject to immediate execution upon capture. This policy basically extinguished any hope for a peaceful settlement, and it made Fannin's position at Goliad completely untenable the second the Alamo fell. He was isolated, and his men were potential targets for execution if caught.
Wow. So this deep dive is really an examination of fatal indecision meeting, imperial cruelty. Let's dedicate part one, then, to the commander himself, Colonel Fannin, and his crucial error, his hesitation.
Yeah, we have to introduce Colonel James W. Fannin, Jr. and the substantial force he commanded. Because this wasn't a tiny garrison, he had nearly 400 men. That's a significant portion of the total available Texian military strength at that time, stationed right there at the old Spanish Presidio of La Bahia.
And these weren't just mercenaries, right? These were committed fighters.
Oh, far from it. The troops were heavily invested in the Texian cause. Our historical records, they confirm this strong pro-independence sentiment. Just a few months earlier, back in November 1835, 92 soldiers and prominent citizens had actually signed and proclaimed a Declaration of Independence right there at Goliad.
So they'd already declared independence locally.
They had. Their commitment was clearly documented. It was heartfelt. They really believed they were fighting for a cause their new homeland had formally declared.
And the composition of his force. That also tells a crucial story about who was most vulnerable to the Mexican advance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Fannin's command included men primarily drawn from the fragile Irish colonies in the area, specifically the settlements of Power at Refugio and McMullen and McGloin at San Patricio. These were frontier communities, very exposed. As one source points out, these colonists were more exposed to Mexican assault than any others in Texas.
Okay, so that creates a conflict for Fannin, right? A dilemma.
A huge one. It created this conflicting set of loyalties. Does he obey Houston's strategic order and abandon the local colonists, including potentially the families of some of his men? Or does he stay and risk being cut off while trying to protect them?
Which brings us right back to Houston's strategy. Houston needed concentration above all else. Fannin needed to save his people, or felt he did. But Houston's command was clear. Fall back on Victoria.
It had to be non-negotiable because Houston saw the bigger strategic picture. The objective was the survival of the whole rebellion, not saving any single fort or settlement. The immediate threat was General Urrea's converging column. Urrea had already swept through those Irish settlements Fannin was worried about, so Fannin had to move immediately to avoid being pincered between Urrea and potentially other forces.
So the command was explicit. The danger was immediate, staring him in the face. Why the delay? What on earth was Fannin doing between March 6th, when the Alamo fell, and March 19th, when he finally moved?
This is where the historical judgment gets really harsh. It's often called inexcusable procrastination. Fannin delayed his retreat for several absolutely critical days. Days that allowed General Urrea's advance elements to close the distance, cutting off his line of retreat. Historians speculate he was just paralyzed by indecision, trying to reconcile his military duty to Houston with his desire to send help to those settlements he felt responsible for.
But didn't he actually try to send small rescue missions? Didn't that make things worse?
Yes, exactly. And that divided his already finite resources. It was strategically unsound. Fannin delayed his big move while waiting for detachments he had sent out, most notably a group under Colonel Ward sent to Refugio to try and retrieve families and troops from that area. He was waiting for them to return, effectively putting his entire command at risk for the sake of getting back only partial reinforcements. He just stayed put, isolated at Goliad, completely exposed.
It sounds like he was treating Goliad as some kind of strategic hub he couldn't give up, rather than just a tactical outpost that had maybe served its purpose and was now a liability.
That's a really good point. Was he perhaps overly confident in the defenses of the Presidio?
Could be.
That's a key possibility, I think. The Presidio, La Bahia, it offered the perceived safety of solid, tall walls, a stark contrast to the open Texian settlements. To abandon that structure and commit 400 men to the open road, that must have felt like a massive risk, psychologically. But by delaying, Fannin ensured the risk became reality, and much worse. He missed the window of opportunity. The gravity of this failure to move, well, it really can't be overstated.
So Fannin was finally compelled to act, but only when Urrea was practically knocking at the door. Let's move to part 2. Trapped on the prairie. The long-delayed retreat begins.
Right. The retreat finally commenced very late, early on March 19th. But here's the key tragedy, the compounding factor. The combination of the initial delay and the slow speed of the column during the retreat itself sealed their fate. Our sources are just merciless in their assessment. One states that nothing prevented the safe withdrawal of that noble band to Victoria except for that critical initial delay and the subsequent slow movement.
Okay, let's dig into the logistics of the march itself. Why were they so slow? Were they carrying too much stuff?
We were heavily encumbered, yeah. Fannin insisted on moving cannon, heavy baggage, large supply wagons, all of which had to be pulled by oxen. And as anyone who knows about oxen will tell you, they are notoriously slow. They need frequent rest, lots of water. So this transformed what should have been a rapid strategic retreat into this cumbersome, slow-motion migration. They spent crucial hours just dismantling things, loading things, and then moving this heavy material instead of prioritizing speed and the safety of the troops.
So they didn't even make it a full day's march before they were caught.
Not even close. They'd only managed about 6 miles. They hadn't even reached the vital cover of the timberline along the Coleto Creek bottomland. The slow-moving column was caught in the middle of an open prairie by the advance elements of General Urrea's army. The terrain itself became Fannin's ultimate enemy, just flat, open land, offering absolutely no cover or advantage to infantry caught out like that.
And this led immediately to the 2-day ordeal we know as the Battle of Coleto Creek. What was the Texian formation? How did they hold up against Urrea's cavalry initially?
Well, when they realized they were surrounded, Fannin's men reacted quickly, forming a hollow square. It's a classic, effective defensive formation against cavalry, and they fought bravely, fiercely. The Texians were known to be highly accurate riflemen, and their defense initially inflicted heavy casualties on the charging Mexican cavalry. But, and this is the crucial part, they were completely exposed, no water source nearby, no chance of relief. By nightfall on the 19th, they were totally surrounded and outnumbered, maybe 3 or 4 to 1.
They held through that night, March 19th. What must that night have been like? Just pinned down in the open, knowing help wasn't coming.
It must have been absolute despair. They fought off continuous attacks through the night, but the psychological toll, the physical toll, It must have been immense. They had little or no water, the wounded were crying out in agony, and adding to the horror, the Mexican forces brought up artillery overnight. So the sight that greeted them on the morning of March 20th was devastating. Urrea's forces had received reinforcements, they'd set up field artillery that could just pound their position at will, and they'd tighten the encirclement. There was no way out.
At that point, Fannin faced an impossible choice, really. Fight to the last man, like the Alamo garrison did, or surrender.
He chose surrender. On the morning of March 20, 1836, Colonel Fannin decided to surrender to avoid what he saw as the certain, pointless annihilation of his entire command. But this is where the ambiguity, the confusion, which proved so fatal, enters the story.
The terms of surrender. What did Fannin believe he had secured?
Fannin and his adjutant, a man named Chadwick, were apparently quite methodical about it. They insisted on having the Articles of Capitulation reduced to writing and signed by the commander of each side. They wanted a formal, documented agreement, and crucially, the Texians firmly believed, based on this process, that they had secured treatment as prisoners of war. They expected they'd eventually be exchanged or perhaps paroled and released, which was, a standard expectation under 19th century military conventions, at least between recognized belligerents.
A signed document. That must have felt like security, like life. Let's transition into part 3. A prisoner's hope, a dictator's decree.
Yeah, the Texians placed immense faith in that written capitulation. Major Wallace and Captain Durang, who acted as the interpreter, they confirmed the terms were agreed upon. So the prisoners marched back to the Presidio at Goliad, genuinely believing they were safe, protected by the honor of the opposing commander, General Urrea, who had signed the document. This false sense of security was reinforced because Urrea himself had agreed to these terms out there on the battlefield.
But the number of prisoners piling up at Goliad started to swell, didn't it? And that drew the wrong kind of attention.
It did. While Fannin's men were confined there, another group of prisoners arrived. These were men from a different incident. They'd been shipwrecked on the coast and tried to claim they were just peaceful immigrants. It didn't work. They were immediately captured, marched to Goliad, and confined separately from Fannin's main group. But the sheer number, you've got nearly 400 of Fannin's men, plus dozens more from these other captures, made Goliad a massive logistical problem, and more importantly, a political problem for the Centralist Command.
And that political problem landed squarely on the desk of Santa Anna himself. This is where the story shifts, isn't it? From tactical mistake and maybe battlefield misunderstanding to cold-blooded political execution.
Exactly. Santa Anna was the political architect of the massacre. He was, as our sources state it quite plainly, to all intents and purposes, the instigator of the murder. He was absolutely determined to crush the rebellion entirely. He viewed any mercy shown towards captured insurgents as a weakness, something that would only prolong the fight. He was convinced that the Texian cause had to be stamped out through terror.
This brings up a critical point about, the laws of war back then. Why did Santa Anna refuse to acknowledge them as legitimate prisoners of war? What was the legal justification in his mind?
Well, it goes back to laws passed by the Mexican Congress in late 1835. These laws specifically decreed that any foreigners taken under arms against the Republic were to be treated not as soldiers, but as pirates or robbers. And under the laws at the time, piracy was punishable by summary execution. No trial needed. Therefore, the moment Fannin's men, many of whom were indeed volunteers from the United States, surrendered, they theoretically forfeited their protection under the normal laws of war, at least according to Santa Anna and the Mexican government's decree.
But General Urrea, the commander on the ground, he's a professional soldier. He had just signed a document effectively guaranteeing their lives, or so the Texians believed. What was the dynamic there between the general in the field and the dictator making policy?
Urrea was caught in a terrible bind between military protocol and political tyranny. He accepted the surrender, possibly intending to honor the terms, or maybe just deferring the decision upwards. We can't be entirely sure of his personal intent. However, Santa Anna completely overrode any military judgment Urrea might have had by sending a direct, secret decree. This decree ordered the execution of every single prisoner. And this decree came from the highest level of government and military authority. Santa Anna was both president and generalissimo. Urrea was technically militarily obligated to follow it.
Did Urrea have any history? Any precedent for carrying out such a brutal order? Had he done anything like this before?
Tragically, yes. And this makes the whole situation even more sinister. Urrea was already known to have executed Colonel King's men after their earlier surrender at Refugio. Remember, that was the detachment Fannin had sent out and was waiting for.
Ah, right. The men Fannin was waiting for.
Yes, their capture and execution happened shortly before Fannin's surrender, so that event should have been a grim warning about Urea's willingness or obligation to follow harsh orders. Even if Urea personally hesitated about the scale of the Goliad execution, his past actions and Santa Anna's absolute authority pretty much ensured the decree would be followed.
And what was Santa Anna's justification for this level of extreme violence? Did he even try to justify it?
It was justified, chillingly, as a cruel necessity. That's the phrase reportedly used. The stated intent was purely strategic, however brutal. It was meant to prevent future rebellions by demonstrating the ultimate consequence. It was meant to terrorize the civilian population into submission, and it was meant to extinguish any lingering hope among Texians for some kind of peaceful compromise or return to the old status quo. For Santa Anna, the bodies of Fannin's men were intended to be a permanent, brutal declaration that the rebellion was over, finished.
A brutal declaration that there was no mercy. For the Texians, the choice was subjugation or death.
Precisely. This decree just erased any ambiguity. It transformed the conflict from, a military campaign with potential rules of engagement into a war of political extermination against the rebellion itself.
Which brings us now to the solemn, horrific climax, Part 4, the Palm Sunday Massacre.
The date itself is just heavy with irony and tragedy. Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836. This day marks one of the darkest, most infamous events in the entire history of the Texas Revolution, maybe in North American history.
How was the execution actually carried out? I mean, marching nearly 400 prisoners out to be killed. Surely that would have caused immediate resistance, chaos.
The method they used was a horrific deception. It was specifically designed to prevent panic and mass revolt until it was too late. The prisoners were woken early in the morning. They were marched out of the Presidio under the false pretense that they were being moved elsewhere, maybe to the coast at Copano Bay for deportation or perhaps relocated inland. This played on the terms they still desperately believed were valid from the surrender agreement.
But they were separated quickly, weren't they? Strategically.
Yes. This was the critical tactical move by the Mexican officers in charge of the execution detail. To ensure the guards could manage the executions simultaneously and minimize the chance of any successful breakout, the prisoners were divided into three main groups. One group was marched out on the road towards Bexar, San Antonio. Another was marched down the road towards Corpus Christi, and two other columns were marched towards the lower ford of the San Antonio River.
So they're isolated into smaller, manageable groups, marching along, still believing, or at least hoping, they were just being transferred. Describe the moment the deception ended, the moment they knew.
After marching only about 1/2 or 3/4 of a mile, so not very far from the Presidio walls, the columns were simultaneously halted. Then, in a chilling, planned maneuver, one file of the Mexican guards suddenly passed through the ranks of the unsuspecting prisoners. This separated the prisoners from the other file of guards who were holding the loaded muskets. It must have been a terrifyingly clear signal of betrayal. But before the realization could truly sink in, before mass resistance could organize, the command was given and the mass execution began. A swift, shocking eruption of gunfire aimed directly into the ranks of the unarmed men.
The chaos must have been just overwhelming.
The survivor accounts describe sheer pandemonium, men scrambling for their lives. Some, even unarmed, apparently attempting to fight the guards hand-to-hand out of sheer desperation. Others desperately trying to run, to break for the nearby thickets along the river or the prairie brush. The massacre was meant to be comprehensive and swift, characterized by the roar of musketry, the screams of the wounded and dying, just unimaginable horror.
We need to consider the specific victims. What was Colonel Fannin's final fate? He wasn't marched out with the others.
No. Colonel Fannin himself was given a separate, distinct execution back inside or near the Presidio walls. He was brought before a firing squad, specifically ordered to be shot alone. There's a legend, or maybe a reported account, that he made 3 requests: to be shot in the heart, not the head, for his personal effects to be sent to his family, and to be given a Christian burial. The accounts say all 3 requests were brutally ignored. He was shot in the face, his belongings were taken, and his body was burned with the others.
And the cruelty extended beyond just the able-bodied troops who had surrendered on the prairie.
Absolutely. The wounded men who could not walk, those lying helpless back in the Presidio, maybe in the chapel used as a hospital, they were executed separately, systematically killed where they lay or dragged out to be shot. It was intended as a complete liquidation of the Texian fighting force that had been captured at Clito Creek. The tragedy touched many families profoundly, including Fannin's own. One source mentions the terrible loss suffered by Fannin, whose eldest son, described as a talented youth, was apparently involved in this bloody butchery. Though the exact details there are sometimes debated, the sense of profound loss is clear.
But amidst this absolute horror, a handful of men survived. Miraculously, really. Their survival was essential, wasn't it?
It was providential, absolutely crucial. Despite the attempt at total liquidation, a small number, maybe 24 or so, out of nearly 400, managed to escape the initial fusillade and the resulting chaos. Some feigned death, others made a run for it into the dense chaparral or dove into the river. Our sources specifically named Daniel Martindale, William Haddon, and Charles Smith as escapees whose accounts proved vital in letting the world know what happened. We also know that a few, like Francisco Garcia, were spared for some reason, sometimes due to the intervention of a sympathetic Mexican officer, like Francita Alaves, the famous Angel of Goliad, or perhaps due to a misunderstanding of their nationality or role, or just pure luck.
These survivors, their testimony, ensured that this atrocity couldn't be covered up, that it would be cemented in the Texian memory and indeed history as a symbol of ultimate betrayal.
Exactly. Their harrowing accounts provided the graphic, horrific details. They turned what might have been reported simply as a military defeat into something far more potent, a unifying rallying cry against perceived barbarity. They provided the moral proof in the eyes of the Texians and many observers that Santa Anna was fighting a war of annihilation, not just suppression.
Okay, let's move towards the conclusion then. The cry for vengeance. What was the immediate consequence of Goliad, militarily and politically?
Militarily, Goliad was undeniably a devastating defeat. It marked the loss of nearly 400 highly motivated, mostly pro-independent soldiers. That was a massive chunk of the available Texian manpower at a critical moment. However, politically, it was a seismic turning point, completely counterproductive to Santa Anna's goals in the long run.
His calculated cruelty backfired utterly.
It did. Our sources are very clear on this. The massacre extinguished any hope for a peaceful settlement and galvanized Texian resistance. If there were any Texians still wavering, maybe arguing for reconciliation or just a return to the Mexican Constitution of 1824, Goliad silenced them forever. The brutality made independence the only acceptable outcome for most.
So by trying to crush the rebellion through sheer terror, he only succeeded in fueling it with this righteous, desperate indignation.
Exactly right. Santa Anna's twin victories, as he saw them at the Alamo and Goliad. Instead of ensuring Texian submission, they created martyrs who now cried out for revenge from beyond the grave. The cry of, "Remember the Alamo," which already represented heroic sacrifice against odds, was immediately powerfully coupled with "Remember Goliad," which came to represent imperial cruelty, massacre, and betrayal. This twin rallying cry echoed across Texas, across the United States, providing this potent moral justification for continuing the war at all costs.
The military force was temporarily shattered, yes, but the Texian will was forged in blood and fire, you could say. But with the army reeling, the focus shifts terrifyingly, doesn't it, to the civilian population. What happened immediately after Goliad became widely known?
With the main Texian forces in the south either destroyed at the Alamo or executed at Goliad, a wave of palpable terror just swept through every settlement between the Colorado River and the Brazos. Civilians, men, women, children, they fled their homes in desperate fear of the advancing Mexican army under Araya and Santa Anna. They weren't just fleeing soldiers anymore. They believed they were fleeing potential massacre. This desperate, terrifying mass exodus is known historically as the runaway scrape.
The news of Goliad must have terrified the civilian population even more than the fall of the Alamo in a way, driving the great majority eastward in this frantic race to escape Uraya's and Santa Anna's advancing columns.
Correct. The roads, or rather the muddy tracks, were clogged with refugees. Families trying to move everything they owned, facing exposure, hunger, disease, all fleeing eastward, generally towards the relative safety of the Sabine River border with the United States. This chaotic movement of fear and flight defined the entire strategic landscape for the next crucial few weeks.
And all that stood in Santa Anna's way now effectively was General Sam Houston and his tiny retreating army. An army that was slowly gathering strength, yes, but also dragging the moral weight and maybe the physical burden of the entire refugee population with them.
That's the critical juncture we reach. Houston was retreating, yes, often criticized for it at the time, but he was retreating strategically towards the border, buying time, training his men, and crucially, gathering the moral fury of the people behind him. His journey and the terrible plight of the refugees during the runaway scrape would define the next and arguably most pivotal phase of the Texas Revolution. Houston's immense challenge was to somehow use the bitter cry for vengeance sparked by those mass graves at Goliad to mold his remaining, often undisciplined, force into a decisive fighting unit capable of facing Santa Anna.
So next time, we'll follow Houston's trail. We'll analyze the logistical nightmare and human tragedy of the civilian exodus during the runaway scrape. And we'll see how Texas attempted to build an army out of fear, grief, and that bitter, burning cry for vengeance. Remember Goliad. Join us then for the next deep dive into the long, uncertain road to San Jacinto.
It's a road fraught with peril, doubt, and retreat, but ultimately leading toward destiny.